We're definitely at probably the tipping point now of the very best players probably are playing a few too many. If you play too many, you will be at a much higher risk of injury. And if the players are injured, you're not going to get to see them play.
It is not healthy to be playing, let's say, 45 games of rugby across a year and training for 50 weeks of contact across a year. So then we've got to understand if that's not healthy, we know that we have to put in limits and restrictions.
Oh, it's so important to be able to just switch off and mentally unplug and unwind.
Hello and welcome to the Players Podcast from International Rugby Players Association, the rugby podcast that delves into the issues facing players and the game. My name is Owen, and alongside me I'm joined by IRPA Chief of Rugby Operations Conrad Smith, Head of Women's Rugby Rachael Burford, and today's guest is a former no-nonsense lock who played the majority of his career with Northampton in England, and now he's head of the Rugby Players Association over there, and arguably the best chef ever to have been on this podcast. Welcome to Christian Day. How are you, Christian?
I'm good, thanks. I mean, it's good after 4 episodes. I'm still holding that title.
We are discussing all things player load guidelines on the show today. It's a very important issue that's been facing the game in recent years. And Conrad, I'll start with you because to understand the guidelines that were brought in the last few weeks, give us a bit of background, because player load matches and training isn't just something that rugby is facing at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, arguably it's sort of the biggest issue across sport. And I know as player associations, we often speak with our counterparts in other sports. We were there at a conference in September with run by World Players. It's effectively player associations across all the American sports, Europeans, in football, NFL, Major League Baseball, everyone, and they're all, I'd say it's alongside image rights and a few other commercial issues, but this idea of player load, and you only need to look at football and tennis at the moment, where both of the player associations are effectively suing or taking their governing bodies to court over player load, and whether the governing bodies are doing enough to manage the player load or whether they are asking too much and effectively scheduling too many matches that players feel obliged to play. And so there's a whole lot of issues within that, but absolutely, you can sense that the commercial drive for more matches, more content, more games, more tournaments, it's across every sport. You're all wanting to grow and expand, but ultimately that's an ask on players, because it's always the ask for the best players to play in those games. That's what they want. And at what point do you draw the line? And obviously in contact sports like ours, there's probably more of a need to draw that line somewhere, but as I say, it's happening everywhere.
Rachael, this isn't just something that affects the men's game. This is something that the women's game wants to get right as well, especially as it continues to professionalise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we're in a position where we're not at a point where the calendar is absolutely rammed with matches, and more matches are trying to be filled into that calendar. But as Conrad says, everybody wants more. They want to expand. We already see that British and Irish Lions are coming. We know, other franchises like the India IPL. So there's great interest around growing and expanding the women's game, but we've got to make sure that we're considering the player load as we go. And there may be differences for females and what player load looks like for them in comparison to the men. And we're all really aware that the women's game lacks so much data and research on this topic specific to the women's game, and that's something that we have to focus on in the future so that we understand what the questions we're asking and we're using evidence-based to support our female athletes.
Christian, can you tell us about your experience in England specifically on this topic, and how much time has it taken up for you? Because obviously it's something that gets a lot of airtime in your part of the world.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I like the way you opened it. This isn't a question unique to rugby union. It's a question that's asked in lots of sports, and for us in England, obviously the Premier League is the the premium competition for football, and their players are starting to voice that they think they play too many games, and they're up in the kind of 70s per year before they go to the Far East for a pre-season tour. So load is an issue for professional sports, full stop. I think in terms of, we're a professional sport, so we need to drive revenue. And this is probably where the real challenge for rugby comes in. That, the primary revenues in rugby are not driven by the revenue is in football, which is the big broadcast deal. The big revenue driver for English rugby clubs is the stadium being full. And in recent years, we're doing a good job of that. Our stadia in the men's premiership are full at the moment and driving really good revenue. So for the people making those decisions, how do we get more? The obvious answer is we'll have more games. But as Conrad says, the very best players, they can't play every game. And we're definitely at probably the tipping point now of the very best players probably are playing a few too many. And how do we manage those players? That we don't want players to not play any games. That's bad for their health as well and bad for rugby. But at the other end of the scale, if you play too many, you will be at a much higher risk of injury. And if the players are injured, you're not going to get to see them play.
Conrad, that's a point that you've really been hot on in the last couple of years, is that if you want to reduce injury levels, specifically concussion and head knocks in our sport, the answer isn't always sanctions and red cards. It's often just playing less rugby. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, and this sometimes gets taken as a maybe criticism of the work we do around sanctioning, and I don't want it to be seen as that. I just want, as you put it in your question, to understand that sanctioning only goes so far, and the real material influence when we talk about player load, exposure to head acceleration events, exposure to concussive events, the easiest way to reduce that for players is just to reduce exposure, reduce the number of games they play, or limit the number of trainings they have across a year. And we're talking about, as we've all sort of mentioned already, those players at the very top. We're not talking about limiting opportunities. We're not talking about stopping growth in the game, or if there's competitions around. We just need to understand that with that growth and with the new competitions, if there is an ask on the same players all of the time, that needs to be restricted. We need to find ways to limit that, and that's obviously the best way forward in terms of how the game can grow commercially, but not put players unnecessarily at risk.
Christian, you mentioned the tipping point there. What are your players saying to you on this one?
Two separate kind of challenges here. One is injury, and one is exposure to head impact. So on the injured front, all our numbers are driven by data, by sports science research. And interesting that Rachel mentioned we're probably lacking a bit in the women's game, but in the men's game we've got quite an extensive record of injury data, and we know that if players play more than 30 games in a year, and it's quite a strange one. It's not necessarily minutes played. It's 30, taking part in 30 games and all the training that comes with that. If you exceed that number, you're at a much higher risk the year after, the season after. So that's where the limits come from. Last year we had maybe 5 or 6 men's players go past those limits, and it was a Lions year, which I know we're probably going to talk about later. Lions years really do put a lot of load on the Northern Hemisphere players. They play the full season and then up to 9 or 10 games on tour, and that's something that's going to come for the women's game too. So it's the league is going to position the limits right on the limit. They want as many games as possible because that drives the revenue. At the same time, we want to protect the best players, and so for the first time this year, we've started individually managing some of those players in their off season, trying to bring them back a little bit. The head impact exposure bit is what Conrad said. It's completely logical that the more training you do that involves contact training, the more exposure you get to impact and the more concussions you're going to have. That's just completely logical. It's something that we need to answer, really. And I think the only way you can do that is restrict the amount of training that you do and aligned with those game limits. That's where I think the starting point is, where we start to reduce that exposure.
Yeah, I think that all makes sense. And I suppose this is where, when we talk about the World Rugby, the load guidelines, that's the origins of this. Knowing all of this that we're talking about now, and then asking of the governing body globally, which is World Rugby, and then obviously within individual unions, asking of the governing bodies, the RFU, the NZRU, depending where you are, what are the sensible and reasonable limits we can place around player load, so that there is more responsibility taken, and we're looking after players. And that, this has been a long journey, I suppose, getting to the point where we are now. But I absolutely see, in the years ahead, there's more. We've talked about the need for research, for science, for data. The more that is collected, I think you'll see the more and more of the tightening around exactly what those restrictions are, and how much, and where we draw the line in terms of what players, how much training they do, and how many matches they play across a year.
Rachael, how much of a factor is money in this? Because if a player who always knows that the career will not last forever has the opportunity to go to different countries, to play lots of games, to get paid more money than they may ever earn in their lifetime, is that something we'll always be up against on this issue?
I think it'll be a factor, of course, but I think, as the boys have said, there are a number of players that are becoming more aware of this, and it's because it's not just in rugby, we're hearing it in other sports. It's becoming something that they're aware of and they're conscious of, and thinking, you talk about it's not a very long career. When you think about it, you want to be able to be at your best when you are able to play and fit to play. And if you're spending far too much time injured or managing because you play too much the following season, then that's going to reduce your earning opportunities and incomes and potential contracts and things like that. So I think it is a challenging balance for players.
I think, sorry, just to come in there, because it's a really good point, and we are here, where we act as player representatives, but we know this is an issue that it doesn't always have full alignment. Like, there are some players that want to play as much as they can, and if there are limits brought in around 30 matches, as Christian says, there'll be the player that wants to play 31st or 32nd because he might see it as a missed opportunity, or so this is, and that's why it is such a difficult issue. But I think when you start talking about that, you got to bring it back to the responsibility, as we do as player representatives, the responsibility around what we know, and we know, particularly around injury rates, head acceleration, event exposure, we know there is a risk of playing too much rugby. And I think if you start with even governing bodies, everyone accepts that it is not healthy to be playing, let's say, 45 games of rugby across a year and training for 50 weeks of contact across a year. So then we've got to understand, if that's not healthy, we know that we have to put in limits and restrictions. What are they? And the governing body has a duty, even if we go, and I promise I won't spend too much time on the legal side of it, but as in around employment law, when there is a risk around contact training, there are risks of injury around matches, and you have, as an employer or as a governing body, you have a responsibility to mitigate risk where they are known. Where the health and safety of your employee or a player, you have a responsibility. We know this is a contact sport. We're not asking people to eliminate that risk. That's a given, but you still are obligated to find reasonable efforts to mitigate against that risk. And so that is all we're talking about: reasonable limits around number of games played in a year, reasonable limits around the amount of contact that players are exposed to across a year. I just think it's an important point to bear in mind, because it is a really difficult sort of balancing act at times when we start talking about limits, whether it's across matches or training.
And I'm sure all we've talked about here as well is player welfare, athlete welfare. There's a whole other side to this, which is like the well-being of the people who play the sport. So if you think of what we're talking about in terms of the people who need their welfare managed the most, it's those internationals who back up the most club games. They also get the international exposure. If I think to what Conrad used to do or what Rachael used to do, flying Northern Hemisphere to Southern Hemisphere to play games, if you add in the international travel, those players will also have the shortest off season. So the kind of the well-being element becomes significant for them as well. And I think, we've had feedback from players who go into Six Nations camp, and it's a pressure cooker for 7 or 8 weeks. There's no escape. And actually, the more modern management of those players tries to get them out of camp every now and again, because being in camp is just so intense. It's burnout would be what people would historically talk about, and cricketers talk about it a lot because their season is so long and they spend so long away from home. I think that element shouldn't be underestimated either.
And I think I've said this before, but in a strange way, because we're a contact sport, we benefit from that because we understand the limits that physically you need breaks. Whereas, as you say, Christian, the cricketers, the footballers, the tennis players, they're not contact sports. And so it's a lot harder for them to argue that, we need a break. They say, well, no, you're not getting injured. There are footballers playing, as you say, 70 games a year and they're not getting injured. So that becomes the norm. And so people forget the mental requirement. Like, people, you need time off. And I know this is the basis for a lot of what the footballers, their claims against FIFA. It's not around injury management anymore. It's around the human right to have rest. Like, they're showing that there are footballers who are assembled almost 365 days of the year. So they don't even have the human right to have some break from their employment, and you can say, they're getting paid, they know what they're doing. That's not right. Everyone would understand the need for rest, from the mental strain, outside of all of the physical elements of the sport you're playing. There is a requirement for relief from that, the mental burden around being in sport. And I think that is something, you look at the guidelines we've presented, the 5 weeks off season. That's, of course, an element of that is around the physical rest, but the primary objective of that is the mental, de-stressing that you absolutely need to re-energize yourself for another year.
Rachael, how important is it to get away from rugby completely? No training, no physio, no team meetings, no strategic sessions. How important is it to go line a beach and just get away from that for a while?
Oh, it's so important to be able to just switch off and mentally unplug and unwind. When you're in high performance sport, you're following a schedule minute by minute. You're, exactly where you got to be, where you got to wear, what time you need to eat. Like, you're constantly on the go, and it's not always physical. You're mentally always on the go. And you talk about the meetings, the details, the follow-ups. You just need to be able to step away from that to reset, rest your mind, your body. And then, like, as Conrad said, nobody can keep going and keep going and keep going. You will end up burning out. So actually being able to take that time away to reset, to re-energize, to be excited about going back and not thinking, oh God, it's Monday again and we're back in training. Like, you want players to be excited about the opportunity that they're having to be part of a professional setup and be in that environment. It's critical for your well-being and for your mental health to be able to step away and then be able to come back to it refreshed.
Another factor that comes into this is travel, and it's something that's not discussed as much because it's mainly, the attritional nature of matches and also training. But especially now in Europe, where you have the URC and the European Champions Cup, and you have teams flying down from, Paris to South Africa and back up to England, and there's a lot of travelling around now. Conrad, you would have been used to it, I suppose, with Super Rugby, but I think it's something that needs a bit of discussion as well, because it is a factor when we talk about player load.
Absolutely. And I think it's one that everyone involved speaks about the need to quantify this somehow, and that's going to be hard, but I absolutely believe we can, and that's where we need to get to, because at the moment it's anecdotal evidence. I've been through it, the trip to South Africa. I mean, we at one point in rugby championship, we'd always play Argentina away, fly across to South Africa, come back to New Zealand, and you could play 3, 4, 5 games in a row, but you'd never feel as exhausted and as fatigued as throwing those flights in between each game. So it's just the hard bit, as we sort of keep getting back to, is if we want to put in guidelines, you need some sort of metric or something around it, and that's where it's getting to again. With footballers are talking about this a lot, and they're working hard to try and understand what that travel, how does that impact, and how we can maybe bring it into some sort of calculation in terms of, so that we could then see the minutes played and the air miles done, and when that equates to a week off. And I don't know if we'll ever get to that point. Maybe that's the direction it's going in, but it is an awareness, absolutely, to answer the question, that's where these guidelines, we don't have anything in the guidelines yet around travel requirements, but it is something that I think everyone is acknowledging and wants to solve.
Christian, one of the key words we use here is guidelines, but we're often asked, why aren't these mandated so that unions or clubs or whatever have to follow them? What's your thinking on that? Is that where we get to eventually? Are these guidelines a kind of a starter, a first step?
Yeah, so I've been really praising the work of Conrad and Rachael with World Rugby. Ultimately, World Rugby's responsibility is to set the standards for the global game. I think we need to acknowledge that every region of the world will have its own traditions, its own way of doing things, its own history. But what the guidelines at World Rugby level does for me is it sets a standard that I can then go to the English domestic game and lobby that they need to become the practice that we adopt. So I can only speak from my own position, but in the men's English game, the vast majority of the World Rugby guidelines are actually enshrined in our governance. So it's not just a guideline anymore, it's clubs have to follow them. So there's never a simple answer here. As people will often refer to the NFL. Well, the NFL is a national competition with no competitors around the world. They completely govern themselves and their rules and do it their way. Rugby's more complex with different regions, different history, different way of doing things. But the more, for me, that the central governing bodies do bear that responsibility that Conrad spoke about, it makes it easier to lobby for your own area and make sure that players are looked after in the right way.
Your area, of course, a couple of clubs went under last year or the last few years. And so that must make it more difficult for you when you're trying to lobby owners and club presidents who say, look, that's fine, but we need the cash or we're going to go out of business. The game needs this. We need full houses and we need as many as possible. Does that go back to that kind of head-to-head thing that we're always going to have in sport?
I think every professional sport will have that. I would more say that what happened in the English game was more COVID related than anything. It was a stress test that the English rugby game didn't have the governance to survive at the time, and it's brought about changes since. I think it's in the news today. The English game's just done their financial management assessments, so there is new governance in place now to try and stop that from ever happening again. There will always exist this push and pull of athlete welfare versus the revenue they can generate. The more the show happens, the more revenue. That's pretty simple. And it's about finding that balance. And in the more modern game now, wherever possible, we're trying to back it up with data. We're trying to back it up with sports science that says, there has to be a limit for these reasons, and then it becomes very difficult to argue against.
I think that's when it will get to the point that we can mandate. And like, to answer this question, when you talk about guidelines and when does it get when are we able to mandate? I think, as Christian's talked about, there's an element of understanding the local competitions, and so maybe the requirement to mandate can only realistically be brought in at a local level, but that point in time is going to depend on the research and the data and the education and understanding that this is the best way to manage players. And I think the easiest comparison to make is around concussion. Like, no one now disputes if a player gets concussed, and there's a very set protocol around graduated return to play. So a player, if you see him concussed in a game and he's diagnosed with concussion, right, he's out for 12 days. And if it's at a community level, he's out for 21 days. So that is justified because everyone acknowledges the risk around concussion, correct? But then if you talk to the doctors and medical researchers around concussion, they will say there is no clear science that supports a number of days. You know, you could go, it is purely individual in terms of each concussion. If I get the same knock as Christian, the same knock as Rach, how we respond can be completely different, and it can be the exact same knock. And equally, if I'm, for some reason, take a lot longer, I can get another knock that may look very much the same, but, you know, how I respond as an individual can be different again. So every knock's different, every individual's different. We all understand that we mandate, whether it's 12 days, 10 days, 21 days, because of the seriousness of the issue and the understanding that that's the path we want to go down of the sport. And as I said, this to me is where we're going to get to eventually. As the understanding and the research and the data grows, we understand more and more around the risks of long-term play, the amount of matches we play. And so when a requirement comes in, right, he's only going to play 30 games, 28 games, whatever it is, the competitions just deal with that. You can still play games, you're just not going to rely on the same players all the time. And there's no reason we can't adapt to that and still commercially be successful as a sport by not always relying on the same players. So, you know, that's just, I think when we look at concussion, we understand how mandating it still works. And I think that's where guidelines will eventually end up around total match numbers and training numbers.
As you know, regards this, another sport that we've mentioned already, like the NFL is a whole different level of revenue and money. It's the most commercial sport in the world. They have pretty strict rules on the management of players and the way that players can train, etc. Because for them, the show is on the weekend. Everyone comes on a Sunday to watch the NFL. If you injure Patrick Mahomes on Tuesday, the owner's going to be asking questions. Like that's the end of the show for them. So they have these regulations on their training, really strict ones. Are you saying their coaches are any different to rugby coaches? They both want to win. They both will push the limits because they want the ultimate performance. Like, we understand that. But it really frustrates me at times when it's kind of like the NFL, this infinite resource sport that will manage its players as optimally as possible, acknowledge there's got to be some regulation because otherwise something will go wrong. To me, if I could make some big decisions for rugby, I'd be like, well, if the NFL are doing it, we need a really good reason not to. And I'm not sure we've got one. That to me is an obvious step forwards. We want to look after the best players because we come to watch them on a weekend. We don't watch them train.
It's interesting, isn't it, where you have players coming back from injury. You know, it's a similar process in a way. Like, they're making sure that they're ready to play. So they kind of have a similar system in, well, they've got to run X amount of high meters. They've got to do this, you know, tick these 5 boxes before they can get back. But then that same kind of management around keeping them fit doesn't necessarily always apply or isn't always thought about. So that individual management about looking after players doesn't come true as much as it does trying to get somebody back fit to play as well.
Do you find, Rach, also, like, on this point, we hear a lot from the women's game, there's almost I wouldn't say a skepticism, but a resistance to some of the guidelines because they think we need more rugby and our players need to train like for a whole year and I really struggle with that, and I'd be keen to get your thoughts, because we're not like these limits. Personally, I think are set very high. Like I don't think, and to go into some of them, we've talked about non-contact blocks, and the reference is made to 12 weeks. That still allows 40 weeks of contact throughout a year. Like, surely that is enough time to develop even someone in the female game that might not have only started when they were 16 or 17. Do you think it's justified, or do you think it's just from this feeling like they don't want any sort of control or rules handed down from World Rugby to be impacting what they're doing at a local level?
I think it's really interesting because players aren't playing that many games yet. And that's the thing. And I think a number of players feel that they're potentially not ready to play at international levels and need to train more, need to play more. We also have challenges around the entry of players coming into the game. So their training age, when did they start? They probably haven't gone through an academy system. We've got athletes on dual careers. So there's so many different factors into the female game that this is why we do need research and data specific to women to understand that actually maybe 30 games, that limit is too many. Or I couldn't imagine that women playing 35 games is going to be safer than men playing 35 games. But I think, there's a number of things that clear and obvious around the rest periods. Players probably, there's a mixed bag, isn't there? Some feel like there's not enough time, some feel that there are, and that's probably that top end of players who are doing cross-border or playing outside of their country and playing the international game that see that 5 weeks as gold dust. And then there's some players that maybe don't get as much exposure to the matches. They're always there training, but they're not playing as much. So feel like that maybe is too much time. So it's a real challenge one, because there are different factors for women in the game. As I said, we're at a point at the moment in England, there's the biggest league, so the most amount of games are being played here. And even still then, if a top flight player plays every international game and every club game, they're still underneath that 30 game threshold.
It's growing, isn't it, Rach? I mean, you said we're lucky we've got the Premiership Women competition, and there's a limited number of games. The Red Roses are centrally managed, as are most other internationals, but I can see a European competition coming. The French clubs are starting to invest in women's rugby. They're going to come, so that will add Europe. And the British Lions are coming. We know that already. So those top players, again, are going to be in demand. I'll be interested to know how the Red Roses feel. They went into camp, I think, kind of end of May, early June. Obviously, mission completed for them, which is amazing. And that Women's World Cup in this country was amazing. But they've now got straight into PWR. They'll go all the way through to the end of the season, into the Six Nations. I reckon there'll be some tired bodies at the end of that this year. So they'll probably be the first women's cohort who've had that much exposure in 1 year. And there'll definitely be some tired bodies and minds.
And then what do you say, Christian? Because I know this, I think, leads into the discussion around, well, who's best to manage those players? Because there'll be coaches, I'm sure, that will say, we don't need guidelines. We can manage. We know our players best. And when they're in our camp, we know when they need a rest. We know when they need to play. And that this shouldn't be dealt with governing bodies setting down restrictions. It should be purely individually managed, because we hear this all the time. How do we respond to that? Or we, using even the women's game example, why is it that we need guidelines and can't just rely on the individual management?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in individual management. I think individual management has taken place for a long time now. I think the professionalism of the game, I can't remember when I started, it wasn't so professional, but certainly I'd say the last 10 years, we've got individual management, haven't we? I think our position would be that we need a framework within which you individually manage your players. the framework removes the outliers, the extremes, and you need that safety rail in a way, that guardrail to prevent people going to excess or extreme, whether it's out of necessity or chasing performance or whatever it might be. I think we all expect players to be individually managed, and they should be. The key indicator for me is particularly the training environment. The training environment's controllable. Employers, as you've said, Conrad, your way of putting it, they have a responsibility to look after their employees. So really, if we're saying that individual management is improving, sports science is improving, surgical techniques, everything else is improving, we should be seeing injury rates going down. We should see the burden of injury on the game going down, particularly the training environment as it becomes more and more professional. But what we're actually seeing is that burden going up. So we're having the same amount of injuries, but they're actually more severe, which tells me that individual management is not really working because more players are getting injured for longer. It's until we can make that line stay flat or go down, we could probably say we could do better.
And I think the footballers' experience, again, like we deal a lot with FIFA Pro, the equivalent player association for football, and there's a sport that's talked about individual management for years. And exactly to your point, Christian, all they're saying is more and more training, more and more matches. And the fact is, we are in a competitive environment. So even if you know that it's probably better for the player not to play this game, if you've got a win on the weekend, the coach is going to play the player. And FIFA Pro do amazing surveys around players and coaches that, through the year. And I still remember the most telling question that they asked. They asked of coaches, how often do you play a player even though in your conscience he should be rested? And it was overwhelming. Over half of the coaches surveyed admitted to playing players that they think should be rested. And why would they? The follow-up question, why? It was almost the majority answer was we needed to win the game. And so it's so hard for a coach in the environment they are when they're employed year by year, season by season, to put the players' welfare first when they are judged by results. And so they're going to force a player to play. And the player, as we said, earlier on, often they want to play. He or she wants to play. And this is why you need guidelines. We're talking about health and safety of people. You can't just rely purely on individual management. I agree with Christian. Individual management is the soul of rugby players. We do this all the time. Coaches do this. But there is a place for guidelines, and that's where the sport is going. And I think it's a good thing.
It's also important to acknowledge that not everybody can do individual management to the level and the detail. The resources in some unions and clubs, and particularly in the women's game, we're still, even though it was an incredible Rugby World Cup, it's still in its infancy in growing in that professional light, that there needs to be some underlying general guidelines for people to be able to use and be able to use as a resource, because not everybody is as equipped as the top professional or has all the knowledge and the personnel to be able to individually manage players.
We could do an audio book on this, never mind a podcast. So just to wrap it up, I suppose the question is this a culture change that we need? The same way as, 20 years ago, you got a concussion, the magic sponge came on, you ran back. That's gone now, thankfully. Is the management of player load like that? It's a culture that needs to change with the help, and this is what I'm getting from you guys, with the help of data and research.
I think so. Yeah. And I just think, as well as, because the growth isn't slowing, like what we talked about right at the start with every sport, every sport's going to continue to want to grow, and how we decide to do that is going to be really, really important. And the importance of guidelines is giving us the ability to embrace growth, look for growth, but knowing that it's not going to jeopardise the health and safety of players. So that's the key bit for me, and the importance of those guidelines in terms of, forging the future for our sport.
Final word to you, Christian.
I think some things that count against rugby here is actually one of its strengths. Rugby is a very traditional sport, and we love the traditions and we love what rugby is, and we don't change very quickly. So I absolutely support the need for data and sports science, but I also don't think that lack of the answer should mean that we should never make a change. I think in recent years, there's been lots of criticism of law changes, but one of the most pleasing things for me was the outlawing of something called the croc roll, which produces horrible knee injuries. It took years of lobbying, but we got there in the end because we don't want to see people's knee get ripped into. And sometimes it takes lots of work, and it shouldn't. We should have changed that rule years ago, but we got there. And hopefully, as we show that kind of progress, people will realise that some progression is always good, and rugby needs to, I think, chase that progression, because other sports are definitely chasing progression. Other sports are saying we're modern and we're going to go forwards, and I think rugby needs to take on the challenge itself.
Well, look, it's a fantastic debate. My thanks to Christian for joining Conrad and Rachael on the show tonight. We'll be back with the next episode soon, and in the meantime, check us out on socials. Hit subscribe to keep in touch, and check out rugbyplayers.org for all your information. That's it for now. We'll chat to you very soon.